Facebook and also to YouTube. And it generates about 800 to 1,000 viewers. We have about 50 or so online directly. So I'd like to welcome you today to our program on electromagnetic pulse and the threat to the United States by China and North Korea related with this area of concern. I'm Dr. Michael Jenkins. I'm chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, and I'm also the president of the UPF, Universal Peace Federation International. We've been doing a series of webinars now for about a year on security and also different aspects of the engagement with the 6 nations around Northeast Asia that were involved with the 6-party talks. We're very honored to present a distinguished panel today. Each one of our panelists will speak for about 7 minutes, and then we'll have discussion afterwards. So our first panelist today, I would like to introduce Dr. Playman Doyle, is the CTO of EMP Shield Incorporated in Burlington, Kansas. The company develops technologies and systems for protection of critical infrastructure from the effects of high altitude electromagnetic pulse. Dr. Playman Doyle has completed his diploma in engineering and radio electronics, and also is followed by his doctoral research in biophysics, and is a visiting research scholar at the physics department of the Catholic University of America. And during that time, he completed a Master of Electrical Engineering degree while studying interaction of biological systems with electromagnetic fields. He followed that with his interdisciplinary doctoral studies for a PhD at the University of Missouri. For more than 20 years, Dr. Playman Doyle was a principal engineer at MRI Global in Kansas City, working on a multitude of scientific and engineering projects. And he also designed and constructed facilities for biobehavioral studies of human exposure to electromagnetic fields, drone systems for atmospheric sampling and sensing, smart dust for long-range sensing. He is a member of the IEEE Electromagnetic Compatibility Society, Microwave and Theory and Techniques Society. He joined and directed the Energy Professional Society while working as a research professor at the University of Missouri and Kansas. We're very honored to present to you our distinguished scholar and author and leader, Dr. Playman Doyle. Welcome, Playman.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. It is my honor and privilege, to say the least, to be part of this discussion. Thank you for the invitation. Usually, I open any presentation by, I know people wonder about my accent. Sorry, I cannot avoid it. And to break the ice, I typically say, I was born east of Mississippi. This happened during my first presentation at a military base, and the audience, they really laughed. Oh yeah, far east. So I was born and raised in Bulgaria, very proud to be a US citizen and to contribute to the betterment of humanity and our country. So without elaborating on past, my focus is on understanding the physics associated with high altitude electromagnetic pulse and trying to develop technology and methods to make our critical infrastructure resilient to the effect of high altitude EMP. And this is also related to not only intentional electromagnetic interference, but some naturally occurring phenomena, which are slightly different, but nevertheless similar to the effect, and the countermeasures could be effective as well. I came to the field of EMP about a year and a half ago from the field of counter drone. We are developing a program for the Navy in which we develop intentional electromagnetic interference sources in order to protect critical infrastructure for, drones and drones in plural as a swarm of drones. So joining the field, I started to meet many people. I have the privilege to work with Dr. David Wings, but some of the very few names that you quickly come to learn in the field, very well known, are Dr. Peter Pratt, Dr. Baker, Dr. Radowski, and many others. Due to the position and the relationship that EMP Shield has with different agencies, we are able to help, sit on many working groups, and help nationally for developing a not only concept but hands-on practical deployment of technology in order to protect the critical infrastructure starting from our electrical grid. So again, very pleased to be part of this panel. Looking forward to a very useful and hopefully interesting, meaningful discussion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dronov. Really honored to receive you, and we look forward to our discussion. Our next presenter today is Mr. David Winks, who's Managing Director of OcuSite and a consultant on cyber, physical, and electromagnetic resilience for critical infrastructure. David's work has focused on this cyber, physical, and other electromagnetic infrastructure resilience. He has a degree in physics and additional coursework in electrical and mechanical engineering. He's worked extensively in national security, including radar, electronic warfare, wireless, fiber, and satellite communications. He has provided radio frequency shielding and EMP surge protection. He has been very much an expert on the DoD, Department of Defense's Electromagnetic Defense Task Force, and an advisor to San Antonio's Electromagnetic Defense Initiative. David serves on InfraGard's National Group and Disaster Resilience Council and DHS Resilient Power Working Group. He's one of the authors and editors of the book, Powering Through, Building Critical Infrastructure Resilience, a critical topic for the time we live, in which we're living. When building communication networks in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, he combined satellite networks using multi-carrier transceivers and demand assigned multiple access, DAMA, control systems with digital cellular technology. He's worked in cyber defense and edge computing. And to improve cyber defense, he developed architectures utilizing binary hardening, software-defined perimeters, zero trust access, artificial intelligence, and automated orchestrations for IT and industrial control systems. He led in the development of containerized EMP shielded optical computing systems. His work in power systems is very well known and includes EMP shielded fuel cells, Stirling engines, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and power generation. He has led the development of EMP shielded multi-megawatt combined heat and power systems using gas turbines with LNG storage. He's the co-inventor of a patent pending solar thermal that can be combined with organic Rankine cycle or supercritical carbon dioxide turbine generation. We are just really honored, David, that you would be with us at this time. Thank you. Teach us and lead us on.
Dr. Jenkins, thank you very much. It's our pleasure to be part of this panel. And at OcuSite, as you mentioned, we focus on increasing resilience for critical infrastructure to cyber, physical, and electromagnetic threats. And we believe that our adversaries will probably use a combination of all the above. So we want to be prepared, and one of our goals is to reduce the consequences of these events. So that would create uncertainty in the mind of the adversaries on whether they could achieve their objectives, so maybe they wouldn't use them. So we think that EMP is one of those things that can be prevented if we act now and take immediate steps. So our goal is really to save the lives of millions of Americans by ensuring that critical infrastructure still functions after an EMP event. So as we think about what can we do as a society to reduce the consequences of this kind of an event, we're focusing on protecting the water and wastewater systems for major cities. One of the goals would be to protect enough cell sites and switch centers to keep the communication systems working, and then to protect the ATM machines and the credit card terminals so people can still buy things and get food and so forth. And we also look at protecting trucking and rail and ports so that we could supply food into major cities. And then we also have looked at protecting hospitals and police stations, fire stations, grocery stores, and fueling stations by building EMP hardened microgrids. Now, one of the technologies that we make use of course, is from Dr. Doinoff's company, EMP Shield. And that's an active EMP surge suppression technique that shunts the pulses to ground. And that's a really good technology for the average consumer to protect their homes and their refrigerators and air conditioners. One of the reasons we think that's really important, and I'm sure we'll touch on this as we go along, but the grid requires balance. You know, you have to balance generation with consumption. And it's all synchronized, kind of like a dance, if you will. And so if there are no consumer items that actually use electricity, we can generate all we want, but the grid's not going to be able to be restored. So by protecting both the generation assets and the consumer ones, now we can bring the grid back up in the event that there is an EMP event. So those are the kind of things that we tend to focus on. We're very solution focused on, you know, how can regular people be part of the solution and you know, hardening our country against such an attack. So with that, I'll conclude there and turn it back over to you, Dr. Jenkins.
I believe we have a most scientific based committee today. Usually when we have various experts in various fields, especially in geopolitical issues, we have to really get the timer out. But I see these experts today are very, very brief and right to the point. So David, we thank you. And I know in our conversation, we'll find out a lot more. The Washington Times has done a number of key pieces on of EMP and the threat of that whole area of electromagnetic pulse. And especially we learned a lot from Ambassador James Woolsey, who's former director of the CIA. And I was quite alarmed when I learned that our electric grid, which is a privately controlled and managed generation source and managing source for our power for the United States, is not hardened and not protected. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, but there's quite a serious issue here, because it means that North Korea, for instance, if they do detonate an atomic weapon in space, they don't have to be very accurate. The pulse generated through that can also knock out whole systems. So we'll be coming back to that. David, thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Peter Vincent Fry at this time. Dr. Fry is Executive Director of the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security, Congressional Advisory Board dedicated to achieving protection of the United States from electromagnetic pulse, cyber attack, mass destruction, terrorism, and other threats to civilian critical infrastructures and on an accelerated basis. Dr. Price served as the Chief of Staff of the Congressional Commission to assess the threat to the United States from electromagnetic pulse from 2001 to 2017. As Director of United States Nuclear Strategy Forum, an advisory board to Congress on policies to counter weapons of mass destruction, he has played a critical role. He served on the professional staff of the House Armed Services Committee of the U.S. Congress with portfolios in nuclear energy, weapons of mass destruction, Russia, China, NATO, the Middle East, intelligence, and terrorism. While serving on that committee, Dr. Pry was chief advisor to the vice chairman of the House Armed Services Committee and the vice chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. Dr. Pry was an intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency responsible for analyzing Soviet and Russian nuclear strategy, operational plans, military doctrine, threat perceptions, and developing U.S. paradigms for strategic warning. He also served as the verification analyst at the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, responsible for assessing Soviet compliance with strategic and military arms control. He's a prolific writer and author. He's written several very popular books: Will America Be Protected, Volume 1 and 2, The Power and the Light, the Congressional EMP Commission's War to Save America, Poseidon, Russia's New Doomsday Machine, The Long Sunday, and many, many others. He's been in a TV documentary and has made a BBC program on the book War Scare, and it became a 2-hour documentary on the Soviet war scare of 1983. We're very honored to receive at this time Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. Dr. Pry, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. There are 3 basic threats that comprise the concern of the EMP Commission and of those of us who are trying to protect the country. One from the sun, the solar superstorm like the 1859 Carrington event is a particular concern, something that rarely happens, maybe once every 100, 150 years. But when it does, it could end our electronic civilization by knocking out electric grids and life-sustaining critical infrastructures everywhere. And it will happen inevitably. In 2012, we were narrowly missed by a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection by a few days. And had that impacted, and we are not ready yet for such an event. That could have been it for us. NASA estimates the likelihood of another Carrington event is 12% per decade, which virtually guarantees within our lifetimes or no later that of our grandchildren are going to experience a catastrophic natural EMP from the sun. Then there's the nuclear EMP, the high altitude EMP, which can be executed by anyone with a nuclear weapon. You mentioned that we are particularly concerned in this panel with China and North Korea. The EMP Commission assessed that both China and North Korea have a weapon that's called a super EMP weapon. It's a nuclear weapon that's specially designed to put out gamma rays to create a extraordinarily powerful EMP fields, 100,000 volts per meter or greater, which vastly exceeds the military hardening standard, even for U.S. strategic forces. And that poses a real threat of possibly being able to win a war with a single blow by means of an EMP attack. Moreover, it was mentioned earlier, I've got a new book called Blackout Warfare that describes the military doctrine of our adversaries. They don't envision employing EMP by itself. It would be used in conjunction with cyber attacks and physical sabotage and non-nuclear EMP weapons, also known as IEMI, but I prefer the phrase non-nuclear EMP weapons. And all 3 of these is sort of a blitzkrieg in the electromagnetic spectrum to knock out our electric grids. And this is regarded by Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran as potentially the most decisive military revolution in history, by attacking the technological Achilles heel of a nation like the United States. You could bring us to our knees and not even have to do battle with the Marines or the Navy or the Air Force and win a war in 24 hours with a single blow, a combined EMP cyber attack. And they have been experimenting with new delivery vehicles like the recently tested fractional orbital bombardment system that combines that with a hypersonic glide vehicle that China did over the summer, which is ideally suited for surprise EMP attack. People don't talk about it much, but the non-nuclear EMP threat should perhaps be of more concern than the nuclear, because it is so easily accessible to terrorist organizations To anybody, there are devices that are not intended to be used as weapons, but for example, a thing called the EMP suitcase that has legitimate peaceful purposes for industrial purposes. But somebody who knew a little something about the electric grid could buy one of those. And if you had enough people running around the country, and a handful of terrorists could in 24 hours collapse the whole North American grid, without a nuclear weapon, just using these non-nuclear EMP devices. That's probably my 5 or 6 minutes, and I think I've covered all the spectrum of threats. I would reiterate, again, China, North Korea, super EMP weapon. We haven't even addressed. Possibly it's being done in the black program, but the EMP Commission was very concerned and had recommended that we needed to increase our military hardening standard to meet this new threat. But to my knowledge, we haven't done that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pry. This is a perfect point for the beginning of our discussion. Ambassador Woolsey is coming. He's having trouble getting on, but we expect him momentarily. I'd like to have all 4 participants on if we could at the same time. What we'd like to do is just open the floor for discussion, and everyone can address one another. I'll help moderate the discussion a little bit. I'd like to start with a question for Dr. Doinov. Can you help us, Playman, to understand for our audience? Our audience today is composed of people who work at the State Department and Intel, as well as Congress and other fields in government, as well as scholars. And we have also a general audience of Washington Times subscribers and readers. So we'd like to get a little bit of a basic understanding of your view on electromagnetic pulse and what are the dangers of the electromagnetic pulse to the U.S. Regular operations of a electronic or the electro generation for a factory or a facility like that. Is that something that you can address?
Yes, of course. So there are 2 major components. Electromagnetic pulse at high altitude is a global impact event. We can talk about the probability for occurrence, which currently is rated as low, but all this can change. And after that, the impact, the hazardous effect. It has to be in the upper atmosphere, and a single detonation can cover the whole United States. In Dr. Peter Spry books, there are multiple scenarios. There are some graphs and charts which describes the radius of impact, the so-called smiley face. Typically, you have a ground zero. And if it's, for example, the nuclear explosion is at, let's say, 300 kilometers above Kansas, the smiley face, the most intense field, will be a little bit south and will not go into the details because if you draw the intensity distribution over the map, it occurs like a smiling face. That's why it's called like this in literature. So after that, we have to consider how this is coupling to the different infrastructure. Why the electrical grid is the most vulnerable? Because it has very long wires. And the pulse itself has 3 phases. Now, I will try to say it quickly in a very easier to understand manner, but picture the very first one is very fast, about 2.5 nanoseconds. At least this is the current standard that IES is using, IEEE. 2.5 nanoseconds rise time, the peak at the 5 nanoseconds after the initial rise of the pulse, the intensity of about 50 kilovolts per meter. And as Dr. Peter Price said, perhaps the newly developed nuclear weapons, which are intentionally constructed to release higher amount of gamma rays, which are the main reason for the E1 of the EMP. And actually, ironically, if you design a poor nuclear bomb, you design better EMP source. And without going into details. After that, there are E2 phase, which as intensity and frequency content may be compared to the lightning strikes. And of course, the intensity depends within the distance to the occurrence of the lightning strike. And it is, at least currently employed assumption is that deployed surge protectors for lightning strikes may handle E2. And then we go to the longest waves, longer occurring E3 phase, which is associated with the blast and hive electromagnetic waves, which are the most dangerous to electrical grid because it couples well with long transmission lines and is the most dangerous to the high voltage transformers. Everybody knows how it takes between 18 to 24 months for such a transformer to be replaced. And
All right.
same concept for deterrence, but we, as when I say with the technology and engineers, we can deploy means to shield, to protect, to prevent the damaging effects of EMP. Now, there are also the concept of using localized or tactical use of EMP. In this case, it will be the nuclear explosion will be conducted at somewhat, let's say, lower altitude from 30, 60, 100 kilometers, and then respectively the radius will be different. What else for this audience is good to say? Good enough if a high altitude electromagnetic pulse is initiated, it will take another at least 18, 24 hours before the atmosphere can settle down and de-energize in order a second one to be effective. However, multiple lower altitude EMP could be conducted simultaneously. What are some of the advantages of high altitude EMP use is that it is perceptually it's bloodless. So at least initially, people do not die. The infrastructure will be damaged, but it's repairably damaged. So in some respect, this can be considered as a cyber type of warfare because it actually damages the physical layer of the network. Also can be compared to the enhanced radiation weapon. And as you mentioned, there is no need for precision. So North Korea doesn't need to have a very good ballistic missile in order to precisely deploy and detonate the weapon. Also, EMP by this, it is perfect for what in military jargon I've heard, anti-access, anti-denial. And especially those currently satellites that orbit south-north, they really avoid the currently deployed detection and protection system for ballistic missiles. So there are certain advantages, the very fact that such an EMP will be somewhat disconnect as being humane in a sense, it doesn't kill people initially, and that's true, people will die following the deprivation from the basic life-supporting necessities that the society has. So another component that strikes me, as we say, responsible artificial intelligence. Currently deploying drones without pilots, somehow the human removes from the responsibility of killing the target. And with EMP, there is also this component. And I do believe, or more precisely sense, that this disconnect somewhat lowers the level, the triggering level for deploying such an attack. Also, and I'll finish with this, it is my intuitive belief that EMP will be only the first event in a series of some sort of confrontation. It will be followed by other more conventional means, but who is to know? This is more for politicians, and we can talk further. Over for now.
Okay. Playman, excellent. David, we'd like to turn to you. How do we protect our nation or our infrastructure from this kind of attack? And can you give us something of your expertise on shielding from EMP?
Sure. There are two kinds of protection. There's passive protection and active protection. So passive protection is the kind of shielding that you would put around something, such as enclosing it in a seam welded steel box, for example. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of great specifications. We've known how to do that for about 50 years. But there are things that you have to do, for the air passages and the connectors that go in and out of such a box, right? But not everything falls into that category. For example, your vehicles, it's awfully hard to put a 1/4-inch plate steel welded box around your car and drive anywhere. So that's where active protection comes in. And what we mean by active protection is that you sense the voltage change or the current change in the wiring systems that indicate, hey, I'm starting to get an induced pulse from this EMP, so I need to shunt that to ground. And basically you give it a different path to get to ground than through your equipment, the one that's easier for it to get to. And so by redirecting, if you will, that's what we would call active protection. So it's a way of taking that pulse a different direction and taking it to ground instead of through your equipment. Now, the good news is that we have equipment that does that. EMP Shield, for example, does that for about 4,000 volts and below. Another company, Advanced Fusion System, does it for medium and high voltage systems. So the technology is out there. On the shielding side, there are companies that make 1/4-inch plates, seam welded steel enclosures. Companies like Armag, for example, or composite shelters like Conductive Composites would do that. So the good news is there are lots of commercial companies, readily available product that we can use to deploy to protect various kinds of infrastructure. I would probably start with what are those things that people in cities would need so that they don't have to leave the city. So one line of thought is to keep the water and wastewater systems operating, because if you have that, you're probably not going to leave to go to someplace uncertain. And so I would say, best bet for your dollar would be to invest in protecting those. And then to start looking at how do you have some basic communications so you can buy and sell things, you could go to the store and transact business. And so protecting at least a minimal set of the cell sites around a city, the switch centers, the fiber optic amplifier points, that would be a really good move. Protecting the ATM machines and the point of sale terminals within businesses would be a good thing. That is what we would call continuity of the economy. And if you can keep that going, you're probably in a pretty good place. And then the last thing would be to protect the trains and the vehicles in the ports, so that if you need to resupply people in the cities, you have the ability to do so. And so there are active protection measures that will ground the pulse as it strikes the electrical system of a vehicle, for example. So the good news is those technologies are out there, they exist. And I think it would be good use of some of this infrastructure money to start investing in those.
Thank you, David. Peter, you were interviewed or quoted in the Washington Times by Bill Gertz, who's written quite a bit on the threat of China and the EMP. But can you help us understand the active component of the threat of utilizing EMP against the United States? I think you're one of the experts in that. And I have a quote from you in the Washington Times there that You mentioned that China's on the verge of deploying or has already deployed, which we know has already happened, hypersonic weapons that could potentially be armed with nuclear and non-nuclear EMP warheads, greatly increasing the threat of surprise attack against US forces in the Pacific and against the United States. Can you enlighten us on this current status that we face now? Now that America is beginning to awaken to the fact that China has very strong ideology and intentions of domination over to become the main power in the Indo-Pacific as well as around the world. Can you help us, Peter, to understand what's the current situation?
Sure. Well, I mentioned that the EMP Commission assessed that both China and North Korea have super EMP weapons, which exceed our military hardening standard. And so that is an enormous attractive feature of doing an EMP attack, because it can neutralize our retaliatory forces and our power projection capabilities. In one of the scenarios, for example, you could have a series of super EMP weapons attacking the handful of counterforce targets in the United States, the ICBM wings, the bomber bases, the key command and control nodes like NORAD headquarters inside Cheyenne Mountain, Peterson Air Force Base, Tinker Air Force Base, about a dozen targets. And you could put a peak field on each of those. You wouldn't necessarily need to put a peak field on each of those with a super EMP weapon. The high altitude burst alone would pose a significant challenge. But if you're China, you're a conservative military planner, you want to give it your best shot to fry the electronics that are hardened to 50,000 volts per meter by means of a super EMP warhead. So this would eliminate the retaliatory capability, which is what we have relied upon all through the Cold War to deter a nuclear conflict in the first place, the ability to retaliate. EMP threatens to take that away. On top of that, it would collapse the electric grid, which is unprotected against EMP effects. You don't even need a super EMP weapon to collapse the electric grid. Any kind of a high altitude EMP is probably going to do that. Militarily, that's profound, because 99% of the electricity that surfaces our military bases, our CONUS military bases that we rely upon for projecting power for our conventional forces, comes from the civilian electric grid. Now, it's true that one of the other attractive features that was mentioned, is the idea of an EMP attack not directly killing people. And that is an attractive feature in the minds of our adversaries, and even on the minds of some of our allies who talk about the use of a nuclear weapon for EMP as being acceptable, including from countries like Japan and Germany, where analysts, where some of the most anti-nuclear people are, some analysts there have said, well, but using the high altitude EMP could be an acceptable use of a nuclear weapon because of the low level of casualties, or the virtual non-existence of casualties as the result of this. But in the long run, you'll end up killing a lot more people if the critical infrastructures are unprotected than you would with a large-scale nuclear attack. The EMP Commission assessed that if we had a nationwide blackout that lasted a year, we could lose up to 90% of our population through starvation, disease, and societal collapse. And that too is part of the adversary calculations, because, imagine a president in a situation where the dispute is over Taiwan, or the dispute is with Russia over the Baltic states, and they do an EMP on the United States. What's the president going to do? Try to go into World War III, which he will surely lose because he's got both boots off with the paralysis of our military forces, or is he going to use the residual capabilities that we have, especially the military capabilities, to try to recover those critical civilian infrastructures, because the clock is ticking toward the deaths of millions of Americans. If a president obeys the Constitution and does what he is supposed to do to provide for the defense of the American people, he's going to give up on Taiwan or the Baltic states, not get involved there, and focus on trying to recover the grid. And that too is part of our adversaries' calculations. Now, these hypersonic glide vehicles really have added a new dimension to this threat, because we can't see them coming. They're flying at such low altitude. 60 to 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, which, by the way, is the optimum altitude for super EMP weapons to put a peak field down if you're going for that multiple EMP attack on target. So that's the optimum altitude. But we can't see the hypersonic glide vehicles over the curvature of the Earth. By the time radars pick them up, it's too late. And that's assuming that they're attacking us from a direction where we have ballistic missile early warning radars and radars that can see them. What China did with the fractional orbital bombardment system combined with a hypersonic glide vehicle gives them the capability to attack us from any direction, including over the South Pole. It was mentioned earlier that we have no ballistic missile early warning radars facing south, nor interceptors facing south. We're blind and defenseless from that direction. So you could do a surprise EMP attack by this means, and we wouldn't even see it coming. We might not even know who attacked us. I mean, which is another important part of deterrence, because the first thing to go when you do an EMP attack are the ballistic missile early warning radars and the satellites. Those national technical means are what we rely upon to tell us, well, who's attacking us? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it North Korea? Is it somebody else? And so all of the fundamentals that we relied upon in the Cold War in terms of early warning, the survivability of our nuclear deterrent, being able to have situational awareness about who's attacking us, all the props are suddenly knocked out from under this by the combination of super EMP weapons with these new technologies like hypersonic glide vehicles. Fortunately, I mean, the good news is, as has been mentioned, there's really no excuse for us to be vulnerable, to EMP. We do know how to protect against it. It's not a technological problem. It's a political problem. I wish, and Congress and the White House, maybe I'm going on too long here, but
Fine.
Congress and the White House, a lot of people blame them. But Congress and the White House have both provided all of the direction and all of the legal authorities necessary to protect the nation. President Trump signed an executive order on EMP. He promised that executive order to me before he was president. I had the privilege of briefing him before he became president at the Iowa caucus. He said, "Don't worry, Dr. Pry, when I'm elected president, we're going to knock their heads together and solve this problem." And I helped write the EMP executive order, as did the EMP Commission. It's an excellent order. Congress, on a bipartisan basis, Democrats and Republicans alike, got behind that executive order and incorporated it into the FY 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. In effect, Congress said, we agree with this executive order, and we're giving it the weight of law. You federal bureaucracy, it is the law that you have to implement this executive order. And the Congress has also passed the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act on a bipartisan basis, which requires the Department of Homeland Security, to work with the utilities to try to protect the nation. But all of this has been futile because we seem to have discovered, I mean, the America I grew up in, if you had an executive order or a law from Congress, it would be done. But we now had this federal bureaucracy that thinks it knows better than White Houses and Congress and congressional commissions. And, there were a handful of people in this federal bureaucracy, in the Department of Energy and the Department of Homeland Security, who've been holding up the train and not acting on these executive orders. One example, and then I'll shut up, is, they would disagree with me. And by the way, the Biden administration deserves credit too. They did not cancel the EMP executive order. The EMP executive order remains operational, and the Biden administration is supposed to be committed to implementing it. We even have for the first time, a czar in the White House, a cyber czar, but she's also an EMP czar, Ann Neuberger, who's supposed to be dedicated to getting the country protected, but it's not happening. And it's because the federal bureaucracy is just doing endless studies. They would say, what are you talking about, Prague? We've got tens of millions of dollars in the infrastructure bill to do additional studies on EMP and how to protect the critical infrastructures. We don't need more studies at this point.
We don't need
We
more
know how to
studies.
protect the grid. We should be
That's
spending
right.
money on actually protecting the grid. But that's what they do. They pretend that they're obeying the executive orders and the legislation by doing endless studies, but they're not moving the ball forward in terms of getting the grid protected.
I'm happy to say that we have a distinguished author asking a question right now, Mr. Humphrey Hoxley, who's the author of Asian Waters, a very excellent summary of the South China Sea and the current situation there, as well as Man on Fire and Man on Ice, which are historical fiction, but very accurate novels that are gripping on what could happen between our adversaries in the United States and UK and so forth. But Humphrey asked this question: what's the estimated cost on protecting the critical infrastructure throughout the US and an agreed upon protection or hardening standard? What is that cost estimated? I'll just open it for, go ahead.
Can I take that? Okay. You know, the EMP Commission came up with a plan in 2008 to protect the bulk power system. Okay, that's not the whole system. That's not the distribution system, but it's the most important part. It's the heart of our electrical. And you know, we estimated you could protect the bulk power system of the United States for $4 to $6 billion. That's protecting all 2,000 DHV transformers, all the generators, you know, all the SCADA systems within the bulk power system. It's not a perfect plan. It also required smart planning from NERC and DOE and DHS, okay? But what it would, so that you could quickly bring back the electric grid before millions of people started starving to death. There are other plans out there, for example, you know, for 20 or $30 billion, you know, you could harden the whole grid to military standards. And then you wouldn't have to have a smart plan. Any dummy could be running the grid and it would survive because it's been hardened to that level. So what does it cost is sort of like asking how much does it cost to protect your house from fire? You know, you can have a really cheap plan and buy a smoke alarm, but that will greatly increase your survivability. If you've got no other protection at all, you could add fire extinguishers, you could build a fire extinguisher into your house. The EMP Commission plan is sort of in between having fire extinguishers and buying a smoke alarm. You know, it's one of the lower cost things. And we did that deliberately because we wanted to make it so affordable that it would be inconceivable that Congress wouldn't vote the money, but they didn't. I mean, we still haven't spent, even with this infrastructure bill, we're not spending $4 to $6 billion just to protect the bulk power system. It's really unconscionable.
And that was David or Playman, can you both address why don't we do this? This is what Ambassador Woolsey has brought up. The cost of hardening the grid and protecting our nation is not exorbitant. And now with this infrastructure bill, is there anything in there? Playman or David, go ahead.
Okay, I will quickly mention. First, I would like to all these people who are more on the political side, because let's remember the topic was China and North Korea.
Yes.
The attack will be simultaneous, not only on United States, the contiguous 48 states, but also simultaneously, I believe, on our forward bases in Guam, in Japan. So we have to be prepared and look more complex on how to defend for a future conflict. Now, going back to the grid, we are working with EMP Shield, with a few groups, CISA, the DHS, and John Bay San Antonio. And I had the honor to be invited as a keynote speaker there. And I introduced the so-called 5R of resilience of the electrical grid. And this includes robustness, redundancy, resourcefulness, response, and recovery. No protection can be 100%. And of course, the cost will be higher if we're trying to get closer to this 100%. But even if we provide, and obviously such protection will be implemented in stages and phases, and we have to start with what is the most critical, because everything is critical, but something is more critical. And I don't have a figure for, and obviously Dr. Peter Pry is much better in this. So I will say that focusing on technology, for example, EMP Shield has the concept of persistent monitoring, detection of E1, deployment of E1 protection, but this cannot be 100%. And after that, disconnecting critical segments of the electrical grid in order to prevent the impact of E3. So with this, I will say that it is possible. That's my point. It is possible. We should not simply complain and whine and say, no, we are vulnerable. No, there is something that can be done. We should, for example, this reminds me, during the Olympic Games in Tokyo on July 12th, the Chinese had a broadcasting how United States will be ready by year 2032. Meaning they're putting us in their game that we are not protected yet, but they're giving us a time window to get ready. Well, we should do it. We have to do it sooner. Over.
Thank you, Playman. David, why don't we do this? What's holding us up? What is it? Ambassador Woolsey has been very clear about this threat, and he's helped. I think he's helped a lot to bring awareness. And also I've been with him on numerous briefings at some of our Air Force facilities, and our military is hardened. And I'm learning today that even there's some super EMPs that may be able to crack that. Why aren't we doing this, David? And what do we need to do to alert American citizens to cause Congress or our president to overcome this bureaucracy that's blocking this? Oh, please unmute.
I think part of it is how we've structured our regulation and incentives for the power grid. We have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and then we have the National
North American Electric Reliability Corporation.
There we go. Remembering all the acronyms is hard, but they're really tasked with looking at power generation and transmission. They're not tasked with looking at distribution and end customer load. So all of the distribution companies are governed typically by the state public utility commissions, and they're concerned about, well, if I go put this equipment in, can I recover it in the rate base because it's going to serve all of the customers? And some have, CenterPoint Energy, for example, down in Houston, protected their substation control houses, and EMP protected those as part of an all hazards protection. They had to upgrade a bunch of them because they were underwater, so they had to elevate them. And while they were doing that, they went ahead and protected those substations, the control houses. So can we do this? Yes, absolutely. But I think it's going to take educating all of the public utility commissioners around the country to say, hey, this is an acceptable thing to do rate recovery. And I think on the federal level, there needs to be incentives for the generators and the grid transmission people to install that. In the same way we give investment tax credits, say, for people to buy renewable energy. If we use that same technique and had investment tax credits for the installation of EMP hardening of critical assets, that would be a smart move. I think the other part of this in protecting our grid is the end consumer electronics. Because without somebody to use the electricity, you can have all the generation you want, but you're still not going to bring the grid back up because you've got to have somebody that uses it. And so what we have to realize is that the cavalry is not coming over the hill here. We're not going to get rescued. We have to rescue ourselves that way by putting this infrastructure in place in advance, putting either the passive or the active protections on our own equipment. The airlines tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first and then help others. Well, I think we should take that same approach to EMP. How about putting EMP protection on the circuit panels in our own homes and our own vehicles, telling our friends about that, and maybe if you're in an apartment building, for example, get together with the other tenants and go to the apartment owner and say, hey, we'd like you to put this in the building. And yes, it'll probably increase their rents but they'll amortize it over a number of years. So, it's probably the cost of a cup of Starbucks coffee every month or something. It's not a huge cost when you spread it out over 10 years.
Well, especially when we just passed a $1.2 trillion funding mechanism, supposedly, or infrastructure, and some of it is for hard infrastructure. I can't understand, Peter, why it didn't have anything for EMP. That's what one of our questions here is, why not? Why didn't, is it, why would the bureaucracy try to, somebody must be believing this is not really a risk.
Well, yeah, the bureaucrats that are being asked to implement the executive order never believed it was a significant risk. The utilities, the electric utilities, have always tried to downplay and lowball the EMP threat. Another acronym is the Electric Power Research Institute. They've been churning out junk science studies, to argue that EMP is not as serious a threat as the EMP Commission has assessed it. That in fact it's not a serious threat at all, and that basically trust the electric power industry. They're going to solve the problem. That's one of the chief problems that the utilities themselves. Let me back up a little bit. The chief reason, the country is still not protected, and it's not just the Biden administration. I mean, all through the Cold War, we knew about EMP, but it was most of what we know today was deeply classified. So you could let the utilities off the hook during the Cold War because they didn't know about it. It wasn't until basically 2008 when the EMP Commission declassified most of the stuff that we're talking about today that it finally came onto the radar screen that we need to do more than just protect national strategic forces and nuclear command and control systems. But we've been following the wrong grand strategy. The grand strategy we have for protecting the grid is what's called a public-private partnership, where the private sector utilities, the 3,000 electric utilities in this country, are the senior partner, and the
Yes.
government is the junior partner. That has to be reversed. This is a national security problem.
Yes.
The government is constitutionally obligated to take the lead, and they do not have the competency in these utilities. EPRI is a great example of that. The EMP Commission, rebutted these studies. They're not legitimate alternative scientific views. They're literally junk science written by people who don't know what they're talking about. But they've put propaganda like that out there to try to slow down the train in terms of getting the country protected. There have been individual states, like in Texas or Maine. I just came from Utah a month ago, where they're talking about passing a bill to try to get the grid within their state protected. And every time one of the states starts moving forward to try to do this, NERC or EPRI will show up to lobby against protecting the grid because they don't want to do it. Now, I just apply some common sense. You don't have to be a physicist or an EMP expert to understand this. Look what happened in Texas. ERCOT
Yes.
wasn't even technically competent to protect the Texas grid from an ice storm. Look what happens in California, all right, with these rolling blackouts and these wildfire towers, where the California electric utilities aren't even competent to know that you can't have a power line tower that's 100 years old that's going to get blown down in a windstorm to cause a forest fire and kill hundreds of people. They're not even competent when it comes to the basics and can't be trusted to implement the basics when it comes to public safety, like ice storms and high winds. So how can you trust them to be the senior partner in a grand strategy to protect against cyber warfare and EMP? These are much more serious and much more sophisticated threats. The government has got to be in charge. We've got to have the defense contractors who know what they're doing, go in and protect these systems. And yes, the government can pay for that, or we can allow them to collect the cost by increasing rates or something. I think ultimately, what really needs to be done at the federal level, one of the things that should be done, because this is not by any means an insurmountable problem, is we need to do what we did for lightning. All right, we've actually already solved a big part of the EMP problem. In the EMP world, we call lightning E2 EMP, because it's very similar to E2 EMP, but we never talk about it. Why is that? Because almost everything is protected against lightning, including the personal computer on my desk. That's because
That's
there's
right.
a little surge arrestor in the plug that will
Yes.
stop the lightning from getting into my personal computer when there's a strike in the lightning line. We could not become an electronic civilization without solving the lightning problem, because it happens all the time. And, you know, we never had a big political debate. You know, nobody complained about it. We just adopted the industry that makes personal computers or makes other important electronic components like SCADAs and stuff like that. They designed lightning protection into it because you just had to. And nobody had to pass a law to make them do that. It's just part of standard engineering practices. Now, if we think of E1 EMP and E3 EMP as super lightning, all right, they rarely
That's right.
happen, but someday they're going to happen. You know, what we need to do is start designing, you know, the hardness right into transformers, design it into SCADAs. I believe the marketplace, if we start doing that, eventually we'll even be able to have personal computers that can stand up very inexpensively. You know, because who could have imagined that you could have a little surge arrestor about that big that would be able to solve the problem of a lightning stroke, you know, which is a very formidable kind of an EMP threat. So this is a solvable problem from the technological standpoint. What's lacking is political leadership and political will.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That was great. And I want to ask our panelists to, if it's okay, I'd like your permission to extend a few more minutes for conversation. It's just too interesting. We have Mr. Humphrey Hawksley also, who was on our panel last week on a different topic. But Humphrey, I'd like to ask you to join in for a minute here, unmute, and I'd like to turn our discussion back to our main topic here, the threat of China and North Korea in this world of EMP. Humphrey, would you like to comment on this?
It was a fascinating conversation, and very good to see David and Peter again, who helped me with the Man on Fire book, which was a speculative fictional EMP attack on Europe, actually, but it's a similar thing. I find having done that research and talked to Peter and David at length and many others, I think it's this, is that when we talk about deploying aircraft carriers and where we're going to position troops and all that sort of thing, when you look at the EMP threat or the cyber attack threat, and we saw what happened to the Colonial Pipeline and as Peter just mentioned, Texas, you think, well, that doesn't really matter that much. So you can spend 5 billion, 10 billion on an aircraft carrier group, but that money would probably be better spent on protecting your electrical grid. Because if you want to, if you want to attack your enemy now, you can destroy their electrical grid. And then as I think was mentioned by somebody earlier, you don't kill anybody. So the buildings are still standing, but the traffic lights don't work and the hospitals don't work. So the population does not turn against the enemy. It turns against its own government for not protecting it. So it's a psychological warfare, a devastating warfare. And the figure that Peter mentioned, the 30 billion, whatever it is, it's not a lot of money, is it? It's small change to make our societies safe.
Thank you, Humphrey. Humphrey's with the BBC and really been a great contributor for these programs. We thank you very much. All right, let's have final comments from everybody, starting with Playman and then David and then Peter. And Humphrey, you're welcome to give a final comment too. Let's talk about the threat of those who would want to do an EMP strike, if possible. I'd like to come back to Playman. How can we, you mentioned it, the Indo-Pacific is certainly part of this attack zone. What can we do besides hardening the grid and hardening our energy?
There is a very recent book called The Long Game, and it starts from a term that in the Chinese military open source starts to occur, the term Shashuxian, which means the assassin's mace. And EMP very nicely fits into the strategy of China implementing this first blunting United States, after that going into doing things differently, and after that trying to displace us, and not only as a national security manner, but world order. So is it dangerous? Yes. Can we do something? Yes. And I'm not going to talk about geopolitically what could be done, because this is not my area of expertise, but I will start saying that we can do, and we are doing actually. I'm a little bit more positive in this regards, but I really value Dr. Pry push and all his active contributions to let's do something, and we will. I will start to manufacture the high voltage transformer here in United States. Or if this is too prohibitively expensive, we can do them in neighboring Mexico or in Canada, where perhaps the electricity and steel is a little bit less expensive. We can manufacture here underground cables and start to making changes on a new deployed grid and new data centers. And in addition to this technology, like many companies, including our EMP Shield, for active protection in addition to the shielding protection, predominantly critical infrastructure and military bases. So it is possible. We just have to do it, and we are doing it. Over.
Thank you. Thank you, Playman. David, go ahead.
I think to follow along that same line of thought with Playman, a lot of people are putting in microgrids, and unfortunately, they're not protecting those microgrids from electromagnetic threats. And so we see the electrification of our country. We're actually becoming more vulnerable to an EMP instead of less vulnerable. And as we move along that path to electric vehicles and all transportation going electric, now it becomes even more so, unless we think ahead and we start protecting them now. And so I think that there are a lot of good solutions that can be EMP hardened. For example, there are very efficient natural gas fuel cells that can be protected. They're already enclosed and they produce megawatts worth of power. So, that's a great use for a microgrid. But building those for the critical things that have to keep going, like the water systems and the wastewaters and the hospitals and the first responder locations, that would make us a lot more resilient. And I think that there may be existing grant funds out there for resilience through various government agencies right now that could be used for that purpose. So I think that, starting with those most critical items and creating islands, if you will, that are resilient, and then starting to connect them, that's how you rebuild the grid in a hardened fashion. So I'll turn that back to you now, sir.
Well, thank you, David. I'm just so interested in this discussion. I think for our audience, we don't realize, and Ambassador Woolsey helped me, we don't realize how quickly no power, no gas, no electricity, no grocery stores, no nothing. And the grid doesn't come back on. And they just have to get the utility company out and fix it. Not if it's a massive strike. And it's not very long before there's utter chaos in our nation. I've been very shocked to see the scenarios described for me. It's in a matter of weeks, it gets very desperate, and we don't realize how serious it is. So I'm going to ask that we have another round of this program in sometime in the coming weeks. And I want to thank Ambassador Woolsey for inspiring us to do this. And unfortunately, technology has not worked for him today, but we'll get him with us. And I'd like to turn over to Peter. We have a couple comments here. One inventor and expert scientist, Frank Bell, has mentioned that he called his local companies about he called FERC about alerting them to the problem of this kind of attack or downfall, and they told him to call his local utility. That's all. There's no there's no awareness in our utility companies or even in many of our agencies. Blanche also wrote that the Space Weather Prediction Center has a subscription service for alerts, warnings, and watches on EMP. So, Peter, back to you with China and North Korea. Do you think they're really? Why don't they use this? They could create a global situation of war and chaos. What's holding it back from happening?
Well, good question. I think in my own view, it's because we are a national security freefall and we haven't hit rock bottom yet. The nuclear posture review is due in January, and the future of the country is very much at stake in what that nuclear posture review is going to do to our nuclear deterrent. Powerful Democrats, both within the Biden administration and in the Congress, want, for example, the United States to get rid of all of our ICBMs. They want an ICBM ban. Adam Smith, for example, has held hearings on, in addition to that, denuclearizing our bomber force so that we would get rid of 2 or 3 triad legs. And then the ballistic missile submarine fleet would be cut in half so that instead of having 14 ballistic missile submarines, we would have 6 and a bare bones minimum deterrent. If I were China or Russia or anybody who was contemplating a nuclear World War III with the United States, I'd want to wait and see, are we actually going to do that to ourselves? That would greatly simplify the problem of winning World War III if we engage in such radical nuclear disarmament. Also, China, believes in the adage from Sun Tzu, their foremost military philosopher, that the best victory is to win without war. Many of us observing the geopolitical scene would say they're well on the way to achieving that. Our allies can see what we're doing to ourselves. They see that we're vulnerable. Look, do you think that all of our allies didn't notice what happened with Colonial Pipeline, for example? You think Ukraine didn't realize and that our NATO European allies didn't realize what the significance of that was? I was hoping that was one of the things that would wake up the Biden administration so that they would redouble their efforts to protect our critical infrastructures. They put out an executive order, but basically said, you utilities are responsible for protecting yourselves. And I think the executive order also means that there are an imposition of fines if they do not report cyber attacks. This means what does that mean? That means the utilities have been getting away without reporting cyber attacks to the federal government. And we don't even have situational awareness of how bad the cyber threat is to our critical infrastructures because the feds haven't been getting the information. So, I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow we did get attacked, all right? But I think they're going to wait to see just how far we are going to diminish ourselves, in terms of these capabilities. Afghanistan is another great example of, the Pentagon damaging its own credibility with our allies. I suspect there's going to be more embarrassing, humiliating blunders like that committed by this administration going down the road. What China and Russia, what the totalitarian powers are hoping for is that some point, our allies will lose confidence in the security guarantees of the United States, will lose confidence in the United States as a partner, and will cut a deal with them. When they decide to do that, they've won World War III without firing a shot. The world order will change without war. And that's what they're hoping to accomplish, to win without war. I believe if they have to go to war, they will. But right now, the prospects never look better for the possibility of achieving victory without war.
Well, thank you, Peter. That's why communications are so important. That's why the Washington Times is also very, very focused on this situation. And we have with us Humphrey Huxley, who is also a renowned author. We've got to get the word out, Humphrey. Why don't you close this out with your final remarks on how can we awaken the people to this serious moment in history.
Well, I had a go at it the other day because I went to test drive a Tesla car, and because we're all meant to be getting electric cars. And I said to the guy, I said, is this hardened against an EMP attack or a cyber attack? Because if it is, the Tesla is going to close on. He didn't know what I was talking about. And this is, you know, if we're all driving electric cars are going to stop, and because that is so computerized, the Tesla and electric, then he has to know, and he has to tell his bosses, and the bosses have to tell the government. But I think we need to do it at that level, as we've heard here. But also, we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, a new generation of weapons of mass destruction that can cripple our societies more than nuclear weapons could. So there needs to be some sort of treaty, some sort of negotiation, some sort of agreement amongst the powers that they will not use them. Now, how that happens, I don't know, but at least they can start talking about space, about cyber, and about EMP. And I think it's up to us to get our members, you know, members of Parliament, members of Congress, to push for those negotiations and awarenesses to start.
Thank you, Humphrey. Thank you, David and Playman, and also Peter. It's excellent panel today. We will be back and we'll continue this topic because you've got everybody going. There's questions coming in, and we're just very, very interested and feel quite urgent about this situation. And we have to awaken the people and deal with this bureaucracy and deal with the reality. It's just unthinkable that for a drop in the bucket compared to the 1 trillion that's going, half of it's going for non-infrastructure issues. It's unthinkable that that grid couldn't be hardened. And we've got to really, really up the ante on working on this. Thank you all. And thank you to our audience. We have distinguished scholars and guests on here. We'd like to introduce you all, but we just want to say thank you for joining us. We'll be here next Tuesday again. And then the first Tuesday of every month, we have the Washington Brief, which is hosted by Ambassador Christopher Hill, former ambassador to Korea, and Ambassador Joe Detrani, and also Dr. Manzaroff of Georgetown, focusing on the Northeast Asia situation as it relates to America. Thank you, and the UK and all of our partners in the world. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week and good Thanksgiving for all of you. And we thank you for being with us for this wonderful program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Happy Thanksgiving all.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Excellent program. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you so much. God
Yeah,
bless.
thank you. It was an
Yeah,
amazing
thank you.
program.
Thanksgiving, everyone.
Mhm.